Hello again. So this will be my Saturn V assembly video. So I have one on GitHub from oh so long, or not on GitHub, on YouTube from oh so long ago, where I assembled this craft, unnarrated. And this time I'll try to come up with enough narration. So a little bit has changed about how it goes together. So I'm just going to leave the old parts kind of nearby because I find it easy to help remind me of what all the parts are. And that's partially the point of why I created the Realism Overhaul FASA craft files, because having something that's already there, right, the right specs, kind of all the elements in place, make it easier, in my opinion and in my experience, to assemble it yourself. So this is the starting part, right? This is the only part that will make it back to Earth. So let's see, I need a parachute. There we go. There we go. So it's got two nodes it's willing to attach to, but we want it on this lower one, and then we want the cover, which I think is still in here. Oh yeah, and I have modified it so that it's actually the right rotation, rather than you having to move it so that those two little dots line up with those jets. I need, let's see, I need that part. I need the the probe. So for my parts, I never use the floating rings, floating spheres. Those are included in FASA, so when it lands, they can inflate. I don't remember if the helicopter pilots inflated it to keep the CSM in its no, in this case it's just the CM, the command module, in its stable. Is it called the stable 1 position? But I don't install those myself because just there's so many parts. This craft is already kind of a low frame rate. If you're not aware, the more parts you have on a craft, it affects the physics of it, and therefore it will run slower on your computer. So they're nice looking parts. By all means, if you like them, you can definitely include them. Oh darn! I totally know this is in here somewhere. Let's see, this is in part why I did the video unnarrated before, because it is, and why I include the craft file in Realism Overhaul, because they are very complex to make. And I'm sure somebody, because there's hundreds of parts and I just quickly flashed through it, somebody saw it. Some fraction of people watching this video will have seen it, and yeah, I'm not seeing it, but that's okay. So I can just steal it from here, which is an advantage. So boom, there we go. I can just pop it off. So I can use this lovely piece here, put it in place, and then put that drogue there. And I can erase the parts I no longer need. So I always put the escape tower on last. I think in some past craft files I didn't even include it at all. There we go. So here's the decoupler. So that's going to be the last thing this pops off before that pops off. In reality, I believe there were tiny parachutes that, little drogues that pulled this off, but I don't know. By no means do I know everything about this. So if you notice, some of the parts are welded. So there's these little RCS ports that used to be separate, and then just because there's no case in which you wouldn't want them there, and they kind of affected the way it looks, they place, I welded them, I added it to the RO mod. And somebody also noticed, yeah, they don't like that I welded the heat shield on. Now that wasn't the kind of an aesthetic or a choice like the RCS. Simply when Kerbal went to 1.1 or 1.0.4, 1.0.5 or something, it's just the whole craft gets a bit of heating around the edge, and either I had to set the max temperature the pod could allow to a laughably insane high value, so that it could still survive even though the heat shield was a separate part, or I had to weld it. So unfortunately I had to weld it on. If somebody wants to try getting it to go without it welded on, they are totally free to do that, but it's just about triage of time, right? What do I have time, what am I interested in getting as good as I can? And man, I spent a lot of time trying to get that. Ultimately, if you spend a couple minutes here for a few days and you can't come up with a fix, you just have to do what you have to do to get it done. So there should be an antenna as well. Okay, let me just steal the antenna from this other part. There's lots of little fiddly parts that I can never quite remember where they are in the menu. There we go. I think the hardest part, my best guess of why people, there we go, let me just steal the antenna from this one, of why people watch this assembly, because they want to build it themselves, but the hardest thing to build, I believe, is how do I get the LEM to sit. And so some people will perhaps just link to or fast forward to that part of this video, but it is coming up. So now this is, everything from here you would you could assemble the base. So let's see, this base is, I found it a moment ago, so I'm going to use the long one. This one will cause it not to collide. So there we go. And I want the Saturn instrument unit. Where are you? Oh, maybe you're in command pods now. Everything moves around. Come on. So those, I think, are just stretches of it for, they're included in realism overhaul, but they're for RP0. There we go. So there's the instrument unit. And all right, so the next thing, sorry, I'm kind of like programmed to do it the way I used to do it, but Crystal, I think, improved some of the nodes a little bit. Like, I used to literally have to use a procedural tank to kind of block up one of the nodes so that things could go in. So you build the lem from the bottom up. That's the way that we can get to work here, because so this part has two main nodes. So it has this top node, which is kind of what acts to acts to support the command module until you get into orbit. And there we go. We want these leaves, so I like to just put one in place, and then I can clone them later as needed. So yeah, so let's build up the lunar module from the bottom. That's the trick. So where are you? Lunar descent engine. So I should probably prune some of these out. Who knows? Maybe I'll refine this video at some point. But again, it's triage of time, and I don't want to kind of pre-bake it, make it look way easier to do than it is, because even in a really basic realism overhaul install, and of course it's easy to confuse. So this is like a stocky version, like a Venn stock revamp. In case you don't have FASA, right? We want you to be able to do the same thing. So descent engine, there we go. So that's the big one. So this will attach to the top node. Might actually be a bit tricky to place in. I might actually, oh no, there we go. So because this is hollow, it places in fairly nicely. So the staging I do all at the end, because there's so many parts to this craft. It is an absolute nightmare in my experience. I'm curious to get the staging all right, because I mean they're going to separate into two separate craft, and they're going to come back together and dock again. It's quite a bit of trial and error in my experience to get those right. So really, I just throw everything of the lem together at this point, just so that they're all, I know what all of the staging icons are. So I've got the engine that will lower it, bring it down to the surface. It looks like I used two different pairs of legs. I think I used that for mass balancing, although I don't know if the legs are different masses anymore. And I don't remember if the symmetry mode supports that offhand. That's why I like to do this just behind the scenes and pass the savings on to you. I'll figure out how the craft file goes together in little bits of time whenever I feel like it, and then share it so people can just throw it together. So let's see. So I can see the nodes on the sides. So let's see if it'll let me do a pair. Come on. So there's the little node. There we go. So are these legs slightly different masses? Not quite. But even if they have slightly different centers of mass, that's could still affect your craft, particularly if you're having an issue where you don't have the engine isn't gimbaling, say. There we go. So I just put them on in pairs because I like that. So even though you don't need a ladder on two sides of it, I find that balances it. Again, this is just how I assemble my craft file. It is an extremely complex thing made of many, many parts, even just in a video game, right? This thing was actually built in reality. Descent, ascent, there we go. It's a lower thrust engine. You can absolutely assemble it how you like to. It's just, I want a craft file that's just basically functional. And there will definitely be differences of opinion about how best to do it. So it's actually, so I think this is the Venn stock one, which actually doesn't look too bad at all. Looks very similar. And so this is the FASA one. Come on. So it should have a node in there to attach the engine. Oh, there we go. It looks, yep, it's nice and centered. See, these RCS thrusters are also separate little models that you can use for other things, but I have them welded on here because when are you going to use this when you don't want the RCS, right? And same with the docking port here. It's just there's so many parts to this craft that don't have to be. So this is the antenna for it, and it just attaches by that one node and all around. It's just such a complex craft to assemble. At some point, I figured I want to make it easier to put together. Okay, and so now I just put it to 4 symmetry, and there we go. So that's the whole lem all together. It is now, thanks to Crystal, much easier to install, to put together than it certainly used to be, because I used to use a procedural thing. But ultimately, when you work on something or play with it, whatever you do a lot, you just kind of become blind to its weaknesses, or get used to the pain in the butt of it. So thanks Crystal / C Tiberius for kind of helping. So oh yeah, I don't know if I re-mentioned it in this video, but Crystal added this longer adapter, so these legs don't poke down into this Saturn instrument unit. In reality it should, and there's still the right size base to do so. It's just right now Realism Overhaul doesn't have kind of a go-to modeler who kind of does work to order or request to order. Raidernick was nice enough to fix the collider on this white part when Kerbal updated and it got broken, so thankfully that's why it doesn't give me problems. I'll be linking in this video to those parts, and also to Raidernick's textures that make this say USA instead of Kerbal states. So let's see, so there's a few different variants of that engine, so I always save it to, so okay, let's see, so this is just like the test version. It's like the Saturn 1B. I don't even know if they flew any of those, but we have the option, and then that's the kind of the 1000 kilonewton thrust, and fill the tank. It kind of has a battery to go with the instrument unit. There we go, so you see it gets the delta V there, starts at a really low thrust. Now, there we go, that's the ring for it. So I won't attach the, as you can see in this one, I attach these little thrusters. Well, I attached obviously the, where are they? The little ullage parts. So these 4 clusters around it, the APS flight packs. Yes, that is a good name for them. I'd expect to see them in here, but for some reason right now I'm not seeing them. See, this is again why I did it. Did this video unnarrated originally, just because then I could practice it a couple of times, and then once I had it figured out, I could just quickly jump through it. Yeah, as Kerbal updated, some of the categories changed, and so there's just so many parts in Realism Overhaul, or in every mod, that there's just not enough people or time to keep up. So if you ever want to contribute to Realism Overhaul, there's no matter what your skill or interest are, there's always a place that you could figure out something you're interested in to help with. Maybe it's in the engines here somewhere, and again, so many parts, I might just not see it. There we go. It is in the engines. I kind of expected in the RCS, but the way that we have it coded to kind of move parts, this does technically have an engine module and an RCS module attached to it in there, so that might be why it gets sorted here. Yeah, so when it originally stages, like when to place it in orbit, that's what these little solids are for. In reality, obviously they weren't little baby sergeants. They and I think they could separate from the craft, because you don't want to push their dead weight to the moon to TLI as well. But yeah, that's why I included them on there, because you use them once to place in orbit, and then these parts, whether you have 2, as few as 2 were used, I think, maybe 2, 3, 4, as many as 8, I think. And you need a very small amount of force to settle the fuel in these tanks before sending them to the moon. But yeah, you can include those yourself if you like. I just used little baby sergeants. It's kind of fiddly to get them in place. I don't think they were in my previous video. But they're just, again, there's a place where I make the judgment that I think it's worth having them in, adding the 4 parts to the craft file, whereas you may not, and that's totally fair. You could just use these to ullage, or just the fuel is still settled enough that you don't need them to get into orbit. But something quite like that was actually used. Here, I'm too lazy to go search for the J2Ul. You often cheat, hold Alt and click, and it gives you, hold Alt, click, gives you a copy of a part. And there we go. So another thing I noticed when I was testing the craft out, so those 4 should gimbal. See, it's kind of, because the craft is so big and getting so confusing, it's getting confused about the staging. Come on. There we go. So those 4 should gimbal. They can kind of rotate, move around to control the direction the craft is pushed in. But I set in the old craft file, and in this one I will as well. This one should not actually be able to gimbal, and that's how I locked it. And I just want to make sure these have the right version. Yeah, the J2, the standard J2. The J2S I don't believe was ever flown, but like all the parts for it were made, so we can find plenty of specs for it to include in real solar systems. So the config is there. If they had kind of designed a second generation of Saturn V's, they probably would have used those. Oh, and on my old craft file, or at least, yeah, on my old craft file, I had, where are the bigger ones? Ullage. So we took a baby Sergeant like this tiny engine, and rescaled it both in size and actual volume of fuel to use as an ullage motor for a situation like this. There we go. Stage 2 ullage rocket. See, we like to reuse models because it saves memory. So I had them on the inside of the ring, which I thought looked nice because you don't then have to have them kind of creating air resistance on the outside. But it turns out that that is not the case. They're the ullage motors to kind of force forward this stage on staging were actually on the outside of the ring. So that's where I'll put them in the new craft file. Let's see, there we go, there's the ring. So having this ring, which also had a broken collider previously, and then Furtsand fixed it. He fixed like tons of the broken colliders. There's just a couple he didn't notice, which is fair, because he focused on stock. So there's this ring, and then this separate ring. So I'm not quite sure why it doesn't look that way in this. I'd have to do a little more research, but the engines in the real Saturn V were quite close to the ring, and so that's why they had, it's called dual plane separation, I believe. So on separating, so this drops the first stage, and then those 4 motors fire to bring it forward, and then so while this is being ullaged forward, and once the first stage has kind of gotten clear, the engines, once they're lit, this ring is like lightly dropped off kind of once everything is in place, because carrying the ring along would be quite a bit of weight, because it's a load-bearing ring, right? It has to hold the rest of the spacecraft that sits above it. It's a hefty ring. So they retain it while these engines are lit, and then they drop it off during staging. And that's so that if you dropped it at the same time that everything else was going on, it might very well bang into the engine and just take out the whole craft, which would have been a tragedy. So that's a clever design consideration. And yeah, most of the craft is pretty much done. I find it pretty straightforward to assemble, but like I said, it's one of my most popular videos, and it's definitely out of date. So I am redoing it with narration, with also with some of the updated changes. And if you don't quite, if you don't like the exact way I've assembled it, that is absolutely fair, but please don't waste your time commenting about it, because the point of the craft file isn't for it to be perfect for everybody. It is, oh darn, wasn't holding Alt. It's just for it to be basically functional. And if you want it slightly different, you can build it yourself, or just take the craft file and modify it, because that's absolutely straightforward to do. Let's see, and then there are, so I don't recall offhand if this is how it was done in reality, but I do like the mechanism here. Oh, come on, where are you? Oh, maybe it's in engines. I'm looking for these 4 parts. So they have solid engines in them, and that's what's used to pull the first stage back from the second stage on staging. I find it very clever how it's done, but I haven't researched to see whether it was done that way in reality. So each of these has an engine, and so that's when the first stage is done and you want to pull it back from the second stage so you can ignite the second stage. They have solid fuel for that. It's very clever, even if they were separate motors. I know there are other mods that have Saturn V's, and I've fiddled with them and used them. Many of them are quite nice, but just kind of as a balance of the texture, the quality of the part, the way we got it. Realism Overhaul now has it to match the specs of the, kind of the size and everything of the real one. it's a good balance. But there are definitely other ones that are more or less accurate. Is it OLDD or Denny TX made one that's kind of more accurate to textures and parts? I find it even more of a monster to assemble, and I don't think he's updated it to be compatible with Kerbal 1 or 0.0.5 or whatever. So also this engine, I don't believe they ever flew any F1As, but they had one, they had, just like with the J2S, they had parts that could have created a more efficient and higher thrust first stage. So let's see if, oh yeah, did I, now why is this craft so light? So what I failed to do was to fill this with liquid hydrogen. There we go. So you can see the all the characteristics of that second stage, and then fill this stage with the kerosene liquid oxygen. So it has a relatively low, even though it's got these huge engines, tons of thrust, because it's like the heaviest craft ever made, it has a low thrust weight ratio. But if you had, say, used, okay, that's not a huge change, but it is if you think about it. So from accelerating at 15% more than g, so it moves up at 0.15 g. Now, if it used these larger engines, but if you didn't change the size of anything else, it would still accelerate off the ground. So 15 to 19 scaling, that's a pretty substantial percentage improvement, I'd say, 15 versus 19. Because if it was just 1 g, it would not move. You'd light the engines and it would sit there until it had burned enough fuel to have a sea level thrust of above 1. So going from 0.15 to 0.19, I think is a pretty substantial amount. But it also lets you, gives you a little more wiggle room, because you could add a couple more percent to one of these upper stages, like they could have stretched the second stage or added a larger payload or all kinds of things. There's lots of flexibility. But there you go. That is, other than those tiny ullage engines. Oh, and I really like these ullage engines, because you need something to pull back the second stage from the third stage on staging. So I also didn't add those larger ullage rockets. I may as well throw them on. I'll obviously throw them on in my craft file, just maybe not in this video, but see here, assemble them here, A to flip them. Obviously you'd want to make sure they're in the right place in the staging, and rotate them into place. So yeah, if you, and now there's just tons of options, I find. I want people to kind of, with whatever ease or interest I have in doing it, if somebody just wants to fly the craft file that I provide, they're welcome to do that, and I'll have it nicely staged, and I'd have action groups set up for various things. Like I like to lock the RCS for the upper stages until you actually use them, for example, or set up an abort procedure. Or somebody can load the craft file and just look at it and make their own, just having seen how this is all assembled. Or however they like to do it. Just like people to have the options and make it kind of as easy as for people to use these recreation craft, kind of learn their rocketry, make what they want of the parts themselves as well. I think that's about it. So thanks for watching. This was my narrated assembly of the Saturn V found in FASA. I'll include some links to the fixed part for this base, thanks to Raidernick for fixing the collider for it, and thanks to Crystal / C Tiberius on GitHub for giving us the longer one, so the legs no longer explode. If anybody's a modeler and is interested in helping us fix the collider for this, you just need to load it in whatever part modeling tool you need and change the collider. Contact us on GitHub or just message me on YouTube. Thanks for watching the assembly video. I hope it's been fun, instructive, useful. Goodbye.